Welcome, everyone, to the Sustainable Media Center conversation with Scott Galloway. As many of you know, Scott has written a delightful, controversial book, Notes on Being a Man, which all of us on this call have the opportunity to be participants in. Some of us are young men, some of us are older men, some of us have teenage children, some of us have older children. But for me as a reader, uh, I found the book uh, provocative and anxiety provoking. That being said, I'm not the subject of this, so I want to welcome our panel. We have 7 young men here from around the world, and they've all been given permission to ask Scott questions. And Scott, similarly, you have permission to ask them questions. Like, here's something I discovered. Does this align with your experience? So, with that, let's just get started. Who wants to go first?
My name is Daniel, and I'm I'm the president of the Global Young Entrepreneur Society, and I'm joining from Vienna, Austria.
Wow.
And my question would be, in your view, what does a world where young men are doing well look like? What would a world like that look like? And how do we get there?
Wow, it's the obvious questions that are most difficult to answer. I think that, okay, so what would it look like? It would look like a world where people from every background, income, ethnicity, income, geography would feel like they got a shot. And the shot would be a shot at some level of dignity, economic security, access to health care, and opportunities to find someone, if that's what they want, to mate, have the economic opportunity to have children. And those studies on what are the happiest countries in the world, in America, we've conflated or believe that happiness is a function of what you can get, basically how much stuff you can get. Whereas 6 of the 10 happiest countries in the world are actually in Northern Europe, and it's what they've shown is it's not only a function of the things you can have, but an absence of fear of things being taken from you. So not only an opportunity to be economically secure and have access to purpose and viability, and should you decide to have a family, have the economic means to have a family, the venues to demonstrate excellence, to find a partner, but also an absence from fear that in the US, if your husband or wife is diagnosed with lung cancer, there's like a 1 in 4 chance you're going to go bankrupt. So, what do I see? I see a world where people feel like they've got a shot, they have individual rights, they have enough prosperity to live with a certain absence of fear from losing their dignity, and they have the opportunity to form what is the basis of a meaningful and happy life across most studies, and that is deep and meaningful relationships across friends, mentors, and mates.
Okay, great. So in terms that sounds great. So if you could propose just one policy, if you could just only advocate for a single policy to support young men, what would that policy be?
So, it's a generous question. I'm spending a lot of time in DC because it's better to be lucky than good, Daniel. And right now, this topic is hot. And the data is so stark around how young men in America are struggling that a lot of, like Governors Newsom and Moore, who are the governors of the biggest state in the US, California, and an important state, Maryland, have said essentially that they're um, going to prioritize the struggles of young men and boys. And that would have been unthinkable for a government leader to single out young men just 5 years ago. If I had a magic wand, I would, in the United States, propose mandatory national service. If you look at levels of teen depression, there's a striking example of 2 countries that have a lack of young adult depression, and that is Singapore and Israel. And they both have mandatory national service. So Israel, regardless of what you think of their actions geopolitically, despite their existential threats, they have very low levels of teen and young adult depression. And I think it's because of mandatory national service. Singapore has the most religiously diverse country in the world, something like 220 religions. And they were fearful that a strong man or negative forces or an economic shock could weaponize these differences in religious beliefs to pit people, one Singaporean against another Singaporean. And so they have mandatory national service as well. I think there's a lot of young people, especially a lot of young men, that would really benefit from kind of the marination or seasoning of a structured 1 or 2 years serving in the agency of something bigger than themselves and having the opportunity to meet kids from different income classes, different from ethnicity, different backgrounds, different sexual orientations, and just see how many. I'm American, even though I'm living in London. To just see how many wonderful Americans there are that are more like them than they think are different based on their identity, and also begin to kind of mend some of the tearing at the fabric where people of my generation, half of us feel good about democracies and capitalism in America, and only 1 in 10 people your age. So I think that connective tissue, a little bit of structure, because I think there's a lot of people who, like me, I showed up to UCLA at the age of 17, and I just wasn't prepared. I wasn't prepared to handle alcohol. I wasn't prepared to handle the social pressure, the academic pressure. And a lot of people say, well, Scott, it's easy for you to require mandatory national service as you've aged out. I actually think if invested and structured well, I think young people would really enjoy it. And I'm not talking about mandatory military service. I'm talking about being a smoke jumper or working at a no-kill animal shelter or being a park ranger or senior care or mentoring other high school students that are struggling. So I think mandatory national service would be one policy I would really advocate for. I'll give you a couple others while I get to play kind of, my magic wand. I think a lot of these problems can be fixed fairly easily with common sense solutions, but the incumbents want to weaponize the illusion of complexity and say things like globalization and AI. The reality is around the West, but especially in the US, we've passed a series of economic policies that effectively transfer money from your generation to mine. And so people my age are 72% wealthier than people my age were 40 years ago. People your age are 24% less wealthy than they were 40 years ago. We've passed a series of tax policies in the West that effectively just transfer money from young to old people. And the greatest strain, look at divorce. The thing that really can take you off track as a young man in your 30s and 40s or a young couple is divorce. You find someone, you get married. Actually, the greatest zone of suicide for a young man is the year after he gets divorced because he loses his primary relationship in his relationship with his children oftentimes. And the primary cause of divorce is not a lack of shared values or infidelity. It's actually economic stress. So I think that the simplest solution would be raising up young people by providing them with, quite frankly, just putting more money in their pockets, $25 an hour minimum wage. The two biggest tax deductions in the United States, Daniel, are mortgage interest rate and capital gains, because people my age own homes and stocks, and people your age make their money from current income and they rent. So there's just all these thinly veiled transfers of wealth from young to old because old people have figured out a way to vote themselves more money. In the US and across the West, in France now, retirees are making more money than people who are working. That's a transfer of wealth from young to old. Every year we transfer $1.2 trillion from young people, working age people in the United States, to the wealthiest generation in history, seniors. 40% of our budget goes to programs for seniors, but only 4.5% goes to the Department of Education or 1.4% to SNAP to help ensure that young kids have nourishment. So national service, a series of economic policies that make young people less economically anxious. Things like universal childcare. Most people think of that as being a female-friendly thing. I think to live in a big city in the West now in a democracy, you need dual income homes. And I think it's very difficult for families to have both parents working when they don't have access to affordable childcare. So I would just like to see we've basically tilted our entire economy to flow money from young to old. I just think we need to tilt it back. If we can't, for the first time in America's history, a 30-year-old isn't doing as well as his or her parents were at 30. And I think that creates tremendous anxiety. It's also been disproportionately damaging for men because while we don't like to talk about this, a man is disproportionately evaluated by society, by mating partners, and quite frankly, by himself based on his economic viability. And when you just suck the economic vitality out of the younger generation, it appears to be especially damaging for young men. So, for example, only 1 in 3 young men under the age of 30 in the US are in a relationship. It's 2 in 3 women. And you think, well, that's mathematically impossible. It's not, because younger women are dating older because they want more economically and emotionally viable men. 75% of women state economic viability is important in a mate. Only 25% of men state the same thing about women. So the economic destruction of people of your generation has been especially hard on young men. And then we can talk about education policy, which I think has become biased against men. So there's a lot of things, but where I would start, and I apologize for the word salad, is mandatory national service that gives young people the opportunity to be outside and in the agency or in the presence of other people, get fit, and find friends, mentors, and mates while serving in the agency of their country.
Hey,
Awesome.
Scott.
Thank you.
Hi. My name's Logan. I'm from Birmingham, Alabama. Recently graduated from grad school. I've been spending some months at home, helping my mom raise my little siblings before applying to law school. And I think a lot of your diagnoses are correct. And you've said yourself that you see Richard Reeves as your Yoda on this subject, right? And I think a lot of what he diagnoses is correct, but I often find his policy options wanting. I was actually, I think your argument is strongest when you talk about economics, because while a lot of these issues are targeted towards men, I end up finding that class stratification is actually more important, is more explanatory than gender here, right? So you look at something like high school graduation rates, the difference between men and women in the United States is somewhere between 5 and 9%, depending on the state. But between states themselves, the state with the lowest high school graduation rate is Arizona, which is 75%, and the state with the highest is Virginia with 95%, right? So something like the mandatory civil service, I think, would raise a lot of people up, a lot of men up, but doesn't actually target that economic chasm, right? And you do talk about these economic issues, but whenever you look at other statistics, it seems to point towards all these other issues going on, such as like deaths of despair, right? I grew up in the Deep South. I have family members that have been severely depressed that have struggled with suicidal ideation. And the suicide gap in the United States is between men and women. I think the ratio is 1 to 6. So for every one woman who commits suicide, there's 6 men. But in other OECD countries, it's only 1 to 2. So I guess how willing are, or sorry, 2 things. One, how much do class differences play into this gender difference, A, and B, how do you read into that discrepancy in the ratio of deaths of despair between the United States and other OECD countries?
It's a really thoughtful question. And I think if I could say, all right, the focus should be on either lifting up young men and the problems facing young men, or we can solve income inequality, I would, in a heartbeat, go after income inequality. Because a lot of the problems I discuss, most of them, not all of them, are solved by money. And that is high school attendance, suicidal ideation, obesity, anxiety. They're inversely correlated to income of the household. Yeah, I mean, there's just no getting around it. I mean, let's look at education. A public school in America spends about $15,000 per student. A public high school in a poor area, 8 to 10,000. Elite private schools spend approximately $75,000 per year per student. So what do you know? If you invest $120,000 in one kid in their education through 18 versus $1 million, the middle income kid gets 120 points greater on the SAT on average, and the upper income household does 250 points greater than the middle income. So if we were really honest about trying to give everyone a standing start at the same place in terms of SAT testing, which is supposed to just measure intellect in addition to preparation, you'd spot the kid from a poor household 370 points. The thing, if you were to reverse engineer to one big problem in society, if you had to pick one piece of data, it would be the following. For the first time in America's history, a 30-year-old man or woman isn't doing as well as his or her parents were at 30. The general compact a society has with its government is that if I play by the rules and I'm a good person and I get a little bit of luck, my daughter and my son will do better than me. And when that doesn't happen, it creates rage and shame because, Logan, I don't know if you have kids or not, but once you have kids, it's a weird sensation because it's the first time where you would rather them be successful than you. And so when your kid isn't successful, it has the double whammy effect of not only is the kid upset, but you're upset. And then you live in a technical age where the kid is reminded 210 times a day on their phone that they're failing. It creates this massive anxiety. The numbers I read are, it's actually 1 to 4 suicide in America. I won't dispute your number of 1 to 2 in other OECD countries. Unfortunately, and again, the solutions are more simple than we want. Almost as many women attempt suicide as men. It's just that men are quote unquote better at it because they're more comfortable with gunplay. And we have guns available everywhere. And that is, you have someone who has a depressive episode. They're just, everything goes black. I struggle with depression. I don't know what it's like to have severe depression, but I know what it's like to think there's no way out. Everything just sucks. And then it doesn't help if it's like, oh, I have an idea. There's a gun upstairs. So I think a lot of this just comes down to, quite frankly, a solution that's become toxic and we don't want to talk about in America. And that is, if you have thoughts of violence, especially thoughts of violence against yourself, it's just too goddamn easy to take action against it. So the gap in suicide, I think, is because probably some economic expectations in America where a capitalist society has a much lower safety net. The upside's greater, and we have this zeitgeist of a meritocracy in the US. And that has a lot of wonderful things about it, but it's a bit of a myth, and that is the general view in America is anyone can make it. Now, that's nice, but it's not true. And the problem with a meritocracy is that if you don't make it, the assumption is it's your fault. And so when you have a young man who's facing headwinds and is trying to play by the rules but can't afford a house, is having trouble demonstrating excellence and finding a mate, is not seen as economically viable, and yet on his phone he's getting pictures of Gulf streams and people partying in Saint-Tropez and Ibiza, which, by the way, is there's so much wealth porn. The people are vomiting this fake version of their life, which by anyone who takes a picture of a jet does not own a jet. It's just so much of this is just such performative bullshit, but it has the impact of making young people feel really bad about their lives. So I think in America, this notion of meritocracy has a dark side. The access to guns, and we do have, I think, in the United States. So, for example, in Germany, it hurts them that they're not as entrepreneurial. They have a huge economy. They don't have nearly, name an important company in Germany in technology. It's like Celonis, SAP. I mean, it's a very short list because the upside is not only not as great as the upside you can recognize in the US, but quite frankly, you can take auto shop in your junior year in high school, do an apprenticeship in your senior year in the Mittelstand, a medium-sized manufacturing company, start at 70, 80,000 euros, and then go to a beer garden where there's beers and trampolines for the kids and have a reasonably nice life. And in the US, if you don't graduate from high school, you're not looking at a nice life in the US. You may be looking at not even being able to afford health insurance. So the lack of the inability to reach the heights you can reach in the US is very motivating and a good thing in the US, but our safety net is right near the floor. So I think there is a lot of anxiety and depression in the US that we don't have in other countries. Steve, you were going to comment?
I'm going to jump in and play the Kara role for a second.
Sure.
we've got 5 young men that I want to make sure all get a chance to ask you a question. So
So I'll stop the word salad.
it's fascinating, but I want to make sure we don't miss anybody. So
Got it.
who wants to go next?
On that note, I'll jump in here. Hi, I'm Scott. My name's Zach. I'm from Vancouver, British Columbia, up here in Canada. I've followed your work since The Algebra of Happiness back in 2019. It's my first introduction. And ever since, I've felt that you're able to get across to my parents and the parents of my peers in a way that me and my friends really can't. And it was something that I've definitely noted and has
Thank you.
continued to surprise me. I could say really similar words, but I think the generational divide can really not have that hit home from impact that someone who they see as a successful thought leader really can. And when I told my parents about having this opportunity, they were more excited, but even their friends were excited. And I think there it kind of shows what a contrast that I'm struggling with right now has been, is that to some degree, I think you are an amazing thought leader. But to me, how do you struggle with that differentiation of being a thought leader for my parents' generation, but not necessarily for my generation, where it's more my parents and those around them who are able to benefit from your support and your learning, and then also then my generation hears some of the things you say and go, yeah, I'm living that every day. And how do we get both groups in a room to be able to make that meaningful progress and work towards the future?
Well, thanks for your generous comments. Look, I think every group needs advocates, and it's also not a zero-sum game. You can advocate for young men, and that shouldn't mean that you don't recognize the immense struggles that women still face. Gay marriage didn't hurt heteronormative marriage. Civil rights didn't hurt white people. I'm trying to advocate for young men. One, because I think the data just reflects they're really struggling and that they're up against real economic and sociological barriers. Two, I relate to them. I was one of the men that was struggling when I was younger. I had an absence of economic and romantic opportunities, and I was just struggling. But what I always say I'm a product of big government. I had assisted lunch when I was a kid. I got Pell Grants. When I applied to UCLA, the admissions rate was 74%. It's now 9%. I bought a house in San Francisco when I was 28 for $280,000 when I was making $100,000, so 2.8 times the average salary out of business school. Now the average salary is 200 grand out of the Haas School of Business, and the average house in San Francisco costs 2.1 million. So it's gone from 2.8 times to 10.1. My total tuition over 7 years was $7,000. Total tuition, undergrad and grad. And I graduated the 2.27 GPA from UCLA, 2.27. And one of the best business schools in the world let me into graduate school. So I want to advocate for young men. And what I find is my biggest fans, so to speak, are young men. But my biggest supporters are mothers, because moms see this. Moms see the average email, and I will wrap up here, Steve. The average email I get from mothers is the following. I have 3 kids, 2 daughters, 1 son. 1 daughter's at Penn, 1 daughter's in PR in Chicago, and my son is in the basement playing video games and vaping. Mothers see what is going on with the struggles that young men face. But I want, like, as you get older, you like to think if you have blessings and economic security, you start thinking about, okay, how do I actually add some of the value back that I registered? And I see an enormous opportunity to advocate for young men. And I do think a lot of people in my generation kind of look around and sort of begrudgingly nod and say, wow, we have been pigs at the trough, and it has come back to haunt us because our kids are disproportionately anxious and unhappy. So I do think there's allies among, quote unquote, the Gen Xers and the boomers who want to see you and your colleagues thrive.
Thank you so much, Scott. And kind of to that same degree, would you say that there's any actionable examples you'd like to see from either this administration or administrations around the world to not just champion young men, but bring them along in the process, give them a seat at the table?
Well, I've said anyone under the age of 40 who's running for Congress, I'll send them $1,000. I just think Congress is too goddamn old. I mean, when 2/3 of our Congress is going to be dead within 25 years from an actuarial standpoint, do they really care about climate change? Are they really worried about the deficit? Are they really worried about, I mean, the reality is, do they have much of an are they vested in your future? And you don't have enough representation. 25% of people under the age of 18 in America, right? But 40% of SNAP recipients are children. Why? Because kids don't vote. and young people don't vote. Basically, old people have figured out a way to vote themselves more money. So how do we get young people? I think young people still, I do think young people have an unfair, dark vision of America. I think America is better than they think, but at the same time, I do think they have a lot of agency still. I think they have more rights and opportunities than almost anywhere in the world. So they do have agency, and I don't like the nihilism I hear from young people. But also, we need more young people elected to office, and we need, quite frankly, we just need to provide young people with more opportunity. But I mean, it sounds very passé, but if young people don't start voting, you're gonna continue to get screwed because our democratic system, the D in our democracy, is working way too well. And that is old people keep voting in even older people who vote old people more money. 40% of all spending in the government goes to people over the age of 65. And consistently every year, investments in technology, education, infrastructure, the things, deficit reduction, the things that would benefit you get stripped out because everyone's like, a $40 billion child tax credit, which would benefit young families, stripped out of the infrastructure bill, but the $120 billion a year cost of living adjustment for Social Security flies right through. So until we have more young people elected to leadership positions and young people begin to vote, that sucking sound of prosperity from your generation to an older generation is going to continue.
Thank you.
Who's next?
So my name is Matthew Stevens. I'm a student at Lemoyne College in Syracuse, New York. Work with the Log Off movement and Designer for Us. You talk a lot about relationships and the loneliness epidemic, especially among young men. What I've noticed though is that young women have this concern that young men are like pretty much sex first. They're always trying to get in their pants, while young men are afraid of talking to women because they're afraid that they're going to come off as a creep. What do you think is the source of this perception, and how do we go about resolving that so that we can create healthier relationships?
So there is a very real issue throughout history of violence against women from men. And 2,500 women are murdered every year by men, but 70% of them, it's men they know. The media, unfortunately, has created a perception sometimes that is a bit exaggerated or misleading. For example, I don't know if you've seen online this TikTok movement, but there's women who are saying they are no longer dating because they pathologize men as being violent predators. That I might be, quote unquote, why would I risk going on a date because I might be unalived, which I guess is a politically correct term of being murdered. And if you look at the actual data, if a man goes on a date, he's 16 times more likely to go home and hurt himself than hurt the person he's dating. The woman going to a date is 4 times more likely to be injured on the car ride over or choked during dinner. So this movement that, quote unquote, young men are dangerous is unhealthy and doesn't match up to the actual data. Because while if a young man becomes dangerous, it's usually dangerous to himself. Also, I do think men have gotten mixed messages that their desire for romantic or sexual relationships has been pathologized and demonized. And something I have said out loud that gets pushback, but I stand by it, is a young man's desire to have romantic and sexual relationships is a feature, not a bug. That the majority of that desire will be channeled to really positive things, to wanting to dress well, wanting to smell nice, wanting to be fit, wanting to have a plan, wanting to demonstrate kindness, to develop the confidence and the skills to approach a stranger while making her feel safe, to be persistent. 80% of couples married longer than 30 years, one person says the one was much more interested in the other in the beginning. It's not like love at first sight, very rarely for both people. And almost always, it was the guy who was much more interested. Because the bottom line is, women are much choosier than men. If you have a room of 100 men and 100 women and there's alcohol involved, the majority of the men would agree to have sex with the majority of the women. The majority of the women would sleep with none of the men. That is the basis of evolution. We are trying to get our seed to the 4 corners of the earth, and women put up a much finer filter to pick the strongest, smartest, and fastest seed. That is not going to change. It's millions of years in the making. But where does a man demonstrate excellence? Because what you find with those couples is typically the female will say, I didn't love him at first, but I found he was really, I went to church and I found he was really kind to his parents. We hung out together with friends and I found he was funny. We worked together and he was so good at what he did. I just got comfortable and felt safe being around him. Where does a young man demonstrate excellence right now? Not as many are going to school. Church attendance or attendance religious institutions is at an all-time low. Remote work is a much bigger deal. 1 in 3 relationships begin at work. And by the way, 99.9% of them are consensual. And also, men have been told, men are afraid to be that guy. 80% of women still expect the man to initiate romantic contact, and yet they risk being that guy, being a creep or perceived as dangerous or a predator if they make an approach and it goes wrong and it's not welcome. And what I do hear from women now is that women in contexts where social are saying, men aren't approaching me. They're just not coming up to me. 45% of men 18 to 25 have never asked a woman out in person. 63% of men under the age of 30 aren't even pursuing a relationship. And on the other side of it, unfortunately, men, rather than take these risks, it is expensive to go out. You face rejection. It is hard to develop the skills to make a successful approach. And then on the other side, they have increasingly lifelike synthetic porn saying, give up on that effort. Just come home and have a reasonable facsimile of a sexual experience with porn. So the result is a lot of young men just aren't developing the skills and feel like the risks are too great for very little upside when they have something almost lifelike at home 24/7 on their computers and their phones. And my fear, Matthew, is that we're going to have a lot of young men who wake up at 30 anxious and depressed and never really know what victory is like. Relationships are hard. And the reason why they're so rewarding is that if you can navigate them, you feel a real sense of victory, a real sense of purpose, and a real sense of reward. And it just breaks my heart that young men have been getting these signals and for a variety of reasons have decided not to take their shot. The only thing I know about success and having a wonderful life, the only thing I know about someone who's punched above their weight class economically and romantically is one thing, and that is they have endured a shit ton of no's. And I worry that men are being seduced to frictionless relationships of yes and are sequestering from relationships that involve no's, which are the only meaningful relationships. And also, I think we need to stop demonizing and pathologizing men's desire to have relationships and sex. It's an incredibly productive thing as long as it's channeled in the right way.
All right, gentlemen, we got 3 people that haven't asked a question. We got about 15 minutes left, so let's jump in here and move fast.
I'll go ahead. Hi, Scott. Thanks for talking. My name is Saheb. I'm from Palo Alto. I'm a student at Stanford, and I run an organization called the Center for Youth and AI. You've argued that there's a structural crisis here, but at the same time, it feels like a lot of the memes in the manosphere, right? They tell guys that it's all society's fault or women's fault, which you talked about people being willing to be told no. And it feels like this is an excuse to be adverse to rejection. I guess my question is that when it comes to relationships, how much of the crisis here do you think is like structural versus self-imposed? If you had to put numbers on it, would it be 80% structural, 20% self-imposed, other way around? And would that change when it comes to solutions? I mean, you already talked a little bit about policy prescriptions.
So let me get this. You're at Stanford studying AI?
CS and philosophy.
Okay, you should be mentoring me. You're going to be just fine. So look, I would say they're up against a lot of structural. I think the two are tied together. I think the media, unfortunately, the Democratic Party, I went to the Democratic National Convention. There was a parade of special interest groups on the stage talking about the very real struggles every special interest group faces. But the only one that wasn't discussed is the group that's fallen furthest fastest, and that is young men. The far right, to their credit, was the first to really notice the struggles of young men. The problem is their solution is to take non-whites and women back to the 50s. And I mentor a lot of young men. I know when they come off the tracks is when they blame women for their romantic problems or they blame immigrants for their economic problems. And there's kind of like, can't save them until they finally have an aha moment and realize that that's not productive and it's just not true. So the manosphere, I understand people see I'm a 61-year-old white heterosexual dude. And when I'm not, quite frankly, I may not be the best messenger for this message because people immediately have a gag reflex when I start talking or advocating for young men because they expect me to then start talking about thinly veiled misogyny, which is what basically the manosphere has promoted. So I think we need a lot of aspirational male role models talking about our struggling young men in the context of we want to be the advocates and afterburners of women's ascent. This isn't, the genders have done a great job of convincing themselves that it's the other gender's fault. And I think it's not a battle between men and women or pro men or pro women. I think it's an argument between what I'd call liberal thought and illiberal thought. A lot of women will say to me, well, Scott, where were you when we were struggling? And you know what the answer is? A lot of us were there for them. Title IX lifted up women in 1973 because it was 40-60 female to male college attendance, and we thought that was wrong. 97% of the elected officials that passed these laws at that time were men. And there are a lot of women advocating for the struggles of young men. So I like to think of it as a battle between liberal thought and illiberal thought. But the greatest alliance in history is the alliance between men and women. So I've really tried hard to say this is not a zero-sum game, that we have one, we want to be supportive of our brothers and of our mothers and sisters' progress, and we want to embrace women who recognize the problem and want to help struggling young men. I think it's structural, and if you yourself feel like a victim and it's self-imposed, I get it, but I think that's more a function of technology attacking your self-esteem, and I think the solutions are more what I call, as I referenced before, structural, around stupid, boring things, not stupid, boring things like economics, more male role models, K through 12, holding kindergartners back a year, red-shirting them because boys are just less mature. I would like to see more structural changes, and then I think, quote unquote, the self-esteem and kind of the manosphere bullshit will just melt away. But Saheb, congrats on on being in the right place at the right time.
Hey Scott, I'm Seán Killingsworth. I founded the Reconnect Movement. We create social clubs for students in high school, college, and folks outside in community to spend time socializing without their phones. When I was in high school, I hated my phone and I got a flip phone when I was a sophomore. And what I discovered, which I thought I was gonna, have this great time socializing with people because I didn't enjoy, social media conversations or socializing. But what happened was when I was at school, everyone around me had AirPods in, they were on their phone constantly, and it was so much more difficult to make friends and have conversations. I've always been an outgoing guy, and I found it to be extremely difficult. And so what my question would be is for young men that are going out into the world and they're not experiencing the same social environments that maybe you or Steve did when you were young men going into bars in college, most people aren't even paying attention to anybody because they're just on their phone. What would be your advice for us to have rich social lives and, finding romantic relationships in these environments?
Well, first off, like you're an aspirational male. People are going to look at you and your progress and how compelling you are. You're a handsome kid. So having people like you advocating for a phone-free, touch grass kind of life, that's going to set a good role model. I also think there's structural changes. I don't think there's any reason anyone under the age of 18 should be on a social media app. I think it should be age gated. I think it should be illegal for people under the age of 18 should be in a synthetic relationship. And the problem is that people will constantly say to me, well, Scott, it's about bad parenting. Like you have control of your kids. And I'm like, well, anyone who says that doesn't have kids. My kids get their homework. If you say no more Snap's bad for you, they're socially isolated, they're ostracized. So unless it's a collective movement and we have collective laws that say no kid under 18 can be on I just don't think there's any upside to kids being on social media apps. I can see maybe on messaging, but we age gate the military, alcohol, motorcycles, cigarettes. Why wouldn't we age gate something that appears to be more damaging to kids' self-esteem? 6% of kids, teenagers, are clinically addicted to drugs and alcohol. It's 24% to social media. 40% of the pubs and the bars in the UK have closed since COVID. Let me give you some untraditional solutions. I'd like to see tax subsidies for third places. These are places that you neither sleep at or work at. I've said this and I've gotten a ton of shit from Andrew Huberman, who I like a lot, and Peter Attia. I have said that within moderation, young people should drink more. I think the anti-alcohol movement is terrible for you. If you're really into fitness and don't want alcohol, more power to you. And if you have the confidence to approach women sober in a strange environment, well done. For the rest of us, being in an environment where maybe we have a couple beers and people are having a good time, I think it's an incredible social lubricant. I'm not suggesting people shouldn't do an audit of their addictions. I'm not suggesting that they should drink to excess. But when I look back, I think the majority of people my age, if they look back on their really wonderful friendships established when they were younger and the romantic opportunities, that being in a third place and sometimes the involvement of alcohol was a key component of that. So show me an HR director that says no one should date at work. I'm going to show you someone who met their husband at work. And show me someone who's in the anti-alcohol movement. I'm going to show you someone who immediately orders a bottle of wine when they're on a date. I think the risk to your 25-year-old liver of alcohol is vastly dwarfed by the risks of social isolation. I'm not suggesting alcohol is for everyone. I think there needs to be a massive movement, investment, and zeitgeist around putting a bunch of men and women in physical proximity with each other and encouraging them to mix. And where do you guys go now? You're not going to religious institutions. You're not going to bars because it's so goddamn expensive. A lot of kids aren't going on campus because of remote schooling. They're not going into work, or they're discouraged from approaching a worker. 1 in 3 relationships begins at work. And men are basically being told, if you ask someone out for coffee and they're not interested and they complain to HR, you're done. You're done. So I want a series of policies that get people out in the company of each other. If it involves alcohol, I don't think that should be demonized. I think that's okay within reason. But more importantly, I think we need a set of policies that create more third places where you can bump off of each other. Because just going online, that market, the mating market online, has become a winner-take-most environment. It's never been better to be in the top 10% of men. It's much worse for the bottom 90, and it's generally worse for all women. It's not a healthy market for the mating market. People need to get out and have regular contact with each other in person. But I'll wrap up here. Very much appreciate what you are trying to do. I think, that takes discipline. And if you spread that word and you're an aspirational male, I think other people are going to sign up for that. I am addicted to my phone. It takes me away from my kids. It takes me away from exercise, meditation, self-care. So I recognize the problems, and people my age are also prone to it as well. It is especially damaging to the young brain who has a more difficult time regulating dopa-inducing activities. Anyways, I think what you're doing is great, Seán.
Connor, you're on.
Yeah. Thank you, Scott. My name is Connor, currently a college student in Poughkeepsie, New York. And as a college student, I was really struck by your chapter in your new book about college. I completely agree that college is a maturity boot camp. And I think that the rise in parents and, like, frankly, a lot of men online that are like showing a Lamborghini in the back and saying, you don't need to go to college, just buy my course and I'll tell you how. I think it's misguided. But I'm wondering a little bit more about your experience in the fraternity at UCLA. Personally, I go to a historically women's college in Poughkeepsie, and a college that meets 100% of demonstrated financial need at that, speaking to some of the economic concerns we've talked about. But we have no Greek life. All of our dorms and the floors are mixed gender. The bathrooms are mixed gender. And I found my perspective widening in a really beautiful way every single day because I'm surrounded by people who are not just men. So I'm wondering, looking back on your experience and maybe what you're telling to your sons, do you think that, like, the Greek life system in college is perpetuating some of the divide and the problems that we're seeing, maybe like the echo chambers, by encouraging young men to socialize almost exclusively with other young men?
That's a thoughtful question. So I've gotten pushback. I'm a huge advocate for the Greek system, fraternities and sororities. When I got to UCLA, I was 17 and I wasn't prepared for college. And what I would advocate for is that you shrink a large, scary environment down to a small number of people. And it might be by joining, the dance group, or, the LGBTQ group. It might be finding your friends in your dorm. for me to be in the company of other men, you get quote unquote a big brother in the fraternity. My big brother on week 3 sat me down and said, "You're smoking too much pot." And I needed to hear that. I was very impressed by 21-year-old men. When you joined a fraternity at UCLA, you were twice as likely to graduate than if you didn't join. And also, to be clear, we were very social with women. That was one of the reasons that people joined fraternities. Having said that, there were certain tropes around alcohol abuse, misogyny that were rampant in fraternities in the 80s. So I don't want to pretend there weren't problems. I found on a net basis that I needed to be in the company of men who were willing to serve as guardrails for me. My big brother told me, you got to drop chemistry. Your classes are too hard, and if you go on academic probation your first semester, you're going to lose confidence. So I'm an advocate for fraternities and sororities. It is not for everybody. Let me be clear. It turns off a lot of people. I understand why. What I'm an advocate for, as soon as you get, as a young man or woman in a large environment, you want to shrink it down and try and find a tribe, if you will, of people who share your interests, where you have an unnatural affinity right out of the gates for one another. Connor, welcome to the Classics Reading Group. Who are you? Where are you from? We're going out. We're going to go see the premiere of the Odyssey. Do you want to? You just need that like support group. And then if something's going wrong with you and you're not showing up to class, what you want is someone who notices and reaches out and says, Connor, what's going on with you? Or if you start acting strange, says, Connor, I'm going to call your parents because something's going on here. Everybody needs their tribe, their people. And I found that the fraternity for me, I needed other men who were smart, ambitious, who were noticing when my behavior was out of line. And also, fraternities are very social places. I needed socialization with women. To be blunt, I lost my virginity at 19. I was very uncomfortable around women, and being in the context of social situations with women really helped me figure out how to interact with women. I didn't know how to do that. And being in a safe environment with friends where there was dancing and events where you were supposed to get a date, these are things I probably should have learned in high school. I didn't. So it was really beneficial for me. And also having a lot of ambitious young men going to medical school and law school created a lot of aspiration for me. And I saw that kid's not that much smarter than me. I can go to business school. He's smart, but he's not that much smarter than me. And I also had someone to ask about the GMAT and how you went about it. So I'm a huge fan of fraternities and sororities. I recognize there's some real flaws there, but I'm an advocate for just finding your people as quickly as possible when you're a young man in a strange environment. Ed, is showing up to UCLA with 30,000 people and those economic and social pressures, that is difficult to navigate that alone. But Connor, good luck at school, and it sounds like you kind of found your people.
Scott, I have one last question. This is a father-to-father question. As somebody who has a young son, share with these young men and with our audience something that you do with your son that brings both you and he great joy.
I still lie down with my 15-year-old when he goes to sleep and we just talk for 10 minutes. My youngest was something out of a Hallmark Channel film. He used to come into my room on a weekend morning and sit on the side of my bed and say, Dad, let's make a plan. It was like something out of a movie. My youngest is more like a kid who assesses the household for vulnerabilities so we can strike when we're at our weakness. I affectionately refer to him as the terrorist. I mean, he is not easy. But there's something about when he's winding down at night and he goes to sleep where he just has a sense of calm, and I lie down with him, and sometimes we just fall asleep together and then I leave. But he starts asking me these really interesting questions. He asks about my childhood. He talks about things that are important to him, and it's a nice moment. And the term I would use for dads, there's no such thing as quality time, there's just garbage time. Because these moments of connection happen randomly. So I call myself an Uber driver. I will take my kids anywhere because I find if I'm not looking at them and I'm driving them, they're more likely, and they don't feel the pressure to speak to me, they're more likely to open up. And, you know, as dads, we like to think that, oh, if I have quality time and do something crazy with them, it'll bond us. Honestly, the only tip I have for dads is spend as much time as possible with your kids. And then I think that the thing that's going to turn my men into better men is not what I say, but what I do and what I'm trying to do. And I think the most important thing you can do for sons is to be super loving and affectionate with their mother. I just think that modeling great behavior and a respect and an affection for their mom and women is going to make them better men.
This has been wonderful. I just want to thank you, Scott, and thank you for the book. Very much appreciate it.
Oh, thank you. What an impressive group of young men. My God.
Well, I mean, and collectively, what makes them amazing. So I will tell you now that we're in year 3 of Sustainable Media Center, on paper, intergenerational seemed easy. Like, oh yeah, we'll put young people and old people together and they'll talk. It turns out to be hard in some ways we didn't imagine, both structurally, who reads email, who's texts, whatever, but also just, young people don't want to be told, well, when I was your age, this is what we did. It's like, yeah, it's a different world. And part of what's exciting about what you do in this larger conversation is you're talking about great big theoretical structural changes, which I think each one of these young men in different ways has the power to implement. So,
Agreed.
So now they get to go do the work, right?
That's
Now
right.
they get to go do the work. So
That's right.
thank you. Thank you all, guys. Appreciate it. Scott, we'll see you soon.
Thank you, gentlemen. Thank you, Stephen.
Thank you, Scott.
Thanks,
Thank you.
guys.
Everyone, thank you so much.
Thanks.